A mega project in which more than 150 countries around the world took part, where promises were made to build new airports, motorways, and seaports, where dreams were sold of creating future Dubais and Singapores. But today, in those very same countries, these mega projects appear unfinished, and the dreams lie shattered. Some are buried under massive debt, while others have turned into scenes of ruins. This was China's biggest global mega project, known as the Belt and Road Initiative. There was a time when it was called the Project of the Century, but today it is being labeled a geopolitical disaster.
And the ones who suffered the most were the poor countries that were shown these beautiful dreams. So what exactly went wrong that today people are pointing fingers at a superpower like China? Welcome once again to Noble's Creation. Viewers, back in 2013, when China's President Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative, also known as BRI, it was described as the biggest plan of the century. Its goal was to create a new Silk Road connecting Asia, Africa, and Europe through railway lines, highways, and ports.
China's mission was to bring poor countries onto the path of development and present itself as a global leader. This vision from China stunned the world. More than 140 countries showed interest in this plan, and many poor nations quickly started taking loans from China. Before long, China had invested over $1.2 trillion into this project. But this money was given in the form of loans to countries that Western banks or the IMF had already deemed too risky to lend to. Soon, however, the true reality of BRI began to surface. It wasn't just an infrastructure project. It was also a geopolitical and economic agenda by China. In reality, China's industrial capacity had grown so massive that it was producing hundreds of thousands of engineers every year. But it was becoming difficult to absorb all of them into jobs within China itself. That's when China decided to export this workforce and expand its geopolitical influence. The plan was simple: provide loans to poor countries for BRI projects, and then use China's own industrial capacity and workforce to build those projects, benefiting China in the process. The biggest issue with BRI is what's known as debt trap diplomacy. This means China gave such massive loans to poor countries that they could never realistically pay them back. And in return, those countries would be forced to hand over their land or critical infrastructure to China. The biggest example of this is Sri Lanka. Sri Lankan leaders were shown dreams that if they built a new port on the Indian Ocean, they could become a regional trade hub like Dubai. The problem was, Sri Lanka already had the Colombo port. But it was mainly a transshipment hub, where cargo from large vessels was transferred to smaller ships. China tempted Sri Lanka with the idea of building a deep-sea port along the busy shipping route from the Strait of Malacca to the Suez Canal. This new port was named Hambantota Port. When Sri Lanka decided to take a $1.3 billion loan from China, the conditions started to appear one by one. The condition was that only Chinese firms would construct the port. The loan had relatively low interest, but if it wasn't repaid, China had the power to take control of the project. Construction was completed, but Hambantota Port never truly became operational. Feasibility studies later revealed that there was no real need for a port in that location. The situation became so bad that only around 30 to 40 ships stopped there in an entire year. Since the port wasn't generating revenue, repaying the loan became impossible. Eventually, in 2017, Sri Lanka was forced to sign an agreement handing over the port to a Chinese company for 99 years. Now, all the revenue from that port goes to China. And Sri Lanka, in a way,
lost a part of its sovereignty. But Sri Lanka wasn't the only country trapped in this web. The African country Zambia, which relies heavily on copper exports, also fell into this trap. Its leaders dreamed of modernizing the economy and started several projects using Chinese loans.
They were told that loans from the IMF and Western countries came with strict conditions, but they never paid attention to the downsides of Chinese loans. Those conditions clearly stated that if the loans weren't repaid, China could take control of their assets. And the cost of these dreams turned out to be massive. By 2020, around 43% of Zambia's total debt was owed to China. And in November 2020, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, trade and tourism collapsed and demand for copper dropped. As a result, Zambia defaulted on its debt. BRI also launched several projects that turned out to be completely useless. These are known as white elephant projects, meaning projects that look grand and impressive but have little to no practical value. Montenegro, a small country in Europe, also fell into this trap. In 2014, it took a $1 billion loan from China. The purpose of this loan was to build the Bar-Bulgare Highway. But the planning of this project was so poor that while construction began by cutting through mountains, the funds ran out within just a small section. Now, only about 41 kilometers of road exist, leading nowhere. So much money was spent on this small stretch that it shook the country's entire economy. Today, Montenegro's debt has exceeded 80% of its GDP, and now it has had to seek help from the IMF and the European Union. Sri Lanka also built an airport near Hambantota Port in hopes of boosting development in the region. The Matala Rajapaksa International Airport was constructed at a cost of $200 million, also funded through Chinese loans. But neither airlines showed interest, nor did passengers arrive. Today, this airport is known as the world's emptiest airport, because flights there are extremely rare. At times, animals, even elephants, have been seen roaming on its runway. On the west coast of South America lies a small country called Ecuador, and it too fell into the grip of BRI. To solve its energy crisis, it partnered with China to build the $2.6 billion Coca-Codo Sinclair Dam. But during construction, Chinese contractors ignored quality standards. Later, it was revealed that officials were bribed to overlook these issues. As a result, more than 17,000 cracks have now appeared in the dam structure. Today, this project is at risk of collapse at any moment, which could turn not just into an economic disaster, but also a major human and environmental crisis. Then came Pakistan's turn. CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, was a $60 billion project for Pakistan. Pakistan had hoped that CPEC would bring electricity, jobs, and economic growth. But most projects were either delayed or failed. The people of Gwadar protested against the lack of water, electricity, and Chinese control. The promised jobs never materialized, and Pakistan's debt burden continued to grow. Now the situation is such that Gwadar Port, which once belonged to Pakistan's authority, is effectively under Chinese control. Around 91% of the port's revenue goes to China, while only 9% remains for Pakistan. BRI faced one of its biggest setbacks when Italy, the only G7 country that had joined, announced its exit from the initiative. China hadn't provided direct cash loans to Italy. Instead, memorandums of understanding, MOUs, were signed, promising Chinese investments and trade deals. However, most of those projects never materialized, and Italy saw very little economic benefit. That's why Italy later called it a big mistake and decided to withdraw from BRI. Apart from Italy, countries like Malaysia, Myanmar, Bangladesh, and Nepal also either canceled some BRI projects or renegotiated their terms.
Seeing these setbacks, the United States and Europe have launched alternative initiatives, such as PGII, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, and Europe's Global Gateway Program. These initiatives promise transparency and low-interest loans, so that countries can avoid falling into China's so-called debt trap. However, this situation has also strengthened ties between China and Russia. After the war in Ukraine, Russia found itself increasingly isolated, and it moved closer to China through initiatives like BRI. This is forming a new geopolitical axis, which could become a serious challenge to American dominance. After 10 years and trillions of dollars spent, BRI is now being called one of the biggest foreign policy failures in modern history.
The biggest reason behind this failure is that BRI was never purely about development. It was largely driven by China's own strategic interests. China wanted to export its excess industrial capacity, gain access to raw materials, and expand its geopolitical influence. At the same time, most of the loans were issued in Chinese yuan because China also wanted to promote its own currency globally. Today, BRI stands at a new turning point. China is now rebranding it as BRI 2.0, with a greater focus on digital infrastructure, green energy, and sustainable projects. But the world is no longer willing to trust promises alone. Countries now want projects that deliver real economic benefits, not just increasing debt burdens. The question now is, while other countries suffered losses from BRI, did China gain anything for it? In reality, things didn't go exactly as China had planned.
China wanted to expand its global control, but instead, it got labeled with debt trap diplomacy. BRI has also contributed to slowing down China's own economy. China now carries the burden of recovering massive loans and managing the projects it has taken control of. On the other hand, through BRI, China has gained direct or indirect stakes in over 100 ports worldwide, which is highly beneficial for its export-driven economy. If the full BRI network is ever completed, it would create the longest land and sea trade network from Asia to Europe, covering nearly 65% of the world's population. We hope you will like and share this video. Thank you so much for your kind comments and support. See you in the next amazing video.